I seem a little logy today, it isn't your fault. I think you think it was, but dental work. No, I'm just going to start now a somewhat different subject matter. We finished up last time what I had anyway to say about extensions, and as perhaps the most elaborate form of empathic speech. And I now want to move over into what I call projective, counter-projective, and counter-introjective speech. And to a large extent, these ideas spring out of a different source than the empathic speech. That is, they principally spring out of they principally spring out of the various aspects of social psychology. And so I want to make a little background. I want to give a little background to those developments. And also, what the thing I'm most interested in doing is raising some questions about the relationship of these forms of speech and these clinical approaches to empathic work. And I have a lot of puzzlement about this, and would welcome your thoughts and discussions as today and as time goes along as well. I wrote a piece called Counter-Projective Statements once, and written a number of them about them, but I began it with a quotation from Proust, which I love, and I'll read to you. It was she who first gave me the idea that a person does not, as I had assumed, stand motionless and clear before our eyes, with his merits, his defects, his plans, his intentions, with regard to ourself, exposed on his surface. GSM3. Like a garden at which, with its borders spread out before us, we gaze through a railing. But, in contrast, is a shadow which we can never succeed in penetrating, of which there is no such thing as direct knowledge, with respect to which we form countless beliefs based upon his words and sometimes upon his actions, though neither words nor actions can give us anything but inadequate, and as it proves, contradictory information. A shadow behind which we can alternately imagine with equal justification that there burns the flame of hatred and of love. And you can see how that would interest me in terms of study of mind and the problem of the ways in which we make ourselves known and the indirectness of much of what we learn and the ways we learn it. Now, when one turns to social psychiatry, because one turns to a lot of things which are by no means simply described, and I arbitrarily lay down the general principle that we mean by psychiatry, that part of psychiatry, psychology, which is concerned with the description and understanding of sort of the environmental envelope of mental life, the surround, what the existentialists call the Mitwelt. And that this study of family, work, society, etc., constitutes its subdivisions. And this is not the same thing as what the world feels like, which is more the study of empathy and existentialism, or the fantasy of the world, which is in part psychoanalysis, but more the facts. In Sullivan's words, what you would have seen if you'd been there. And although that seems like a sharp separation between feelings and fantasies and facts, it falls apart when you look more closely at it, and I hope we can discuss what extent to which these things are really different and to what extent it is illuminating to make that kind of distinction. Nevertheless, we all know in part what we mean. We know that social psychiatry arises in part out of social work, that the earliest methods of social psychiatry were the methods of social work, and that the methods of social work were very largely investigative in the sense of physically investigative. That is, that Adolf Meyer's wife went out and visited the families in their homes. People did the same thing for factories and schools, and etc. And this whole movement away from the clinic, away from the hospital, into the world at large was, of course, the most distinguishing feature of this investigation. It's also obvious, I think, that these methods of discovering about the world are subject to the distortions of measurement as any other psychological measure. So that when you read about Mrs. Meyer's visits to the families in Baltimore where she did her work largely, it's clear that she, being a ladylike person, would tell people when she was coming, and there was no effort to spring things on families. And the result was that what she saw of family life, of course, what was that part of family life that the families were prepared to reveal to her. And this remains, to a considerable extent, sort of the burden of social work. That is that we, like the method of questions upon which it heavily depends, it's subject terribly to the cooperation, frankness, willingness, etc. of the informants, whether in the hospital or in their own homes, to actually reveal very much about themselves. It's true that in the United States, from the 1940s on, social work education particularly was very, very heavily infiltrated by psychoanalysis. And those of you who know social work, as it's been practiced largely in this hospital, for example, know that kind of investigation has only recently come back in. And there was a very considerable period when social workers really worked pre-associatively. They were much more concerned with the fantasy meanings of patients' experiences than with the veridical account of the experiences themselves. And as you know, with the community health movement particularly, there's been a movement back into the original social work functions of contacting relatives, describing phenomena, serving as helpers to the family. But the impact of psychoanalysis on social work in this country was enormous, and really made social work into an almost ancillary field of psychoanalysis. The instrument there, which you might be aware of, is the so-called process recording business, which was highly developed in the social work schools, and perhaps the place where the discussion of an interview along psychodynamic lines was most highly developed, curiously. I think myself it's a function partly of sexism, and that the women took up the mission of their psychoanalytic colleagues and teachers and therapists, and with a degree of enthusiasm that almost nobody else did. American psychiatry. Be that as it may, it seems to me the mainstream of social psychiatry has gone on independent of that, and again, as I say, returned to its origins more recently. However, there has been extraordinarily little sophistication of the methods of social work, in my opinion. And the two studies or the two people that I'm going to mention have been, in my mind, and maybe others of you know others, but in my mind, the only figures who have ever really begun to bring social psychiatry up into the mainstream. Now, I leave out from that, of course, the developments in family work, group work, which are part of this whole movement. And that constitutes a separate subject that we must talk a little bit about anyway. The two figures that have, to my mind, made the most signal contributions to this whole business of trying to find out what actually happened are Adelaide Johnson and Harry Stack Sullivan. And they went about it in somewhat different ways, although it's interesting that they had in common a great interest in electronic methods. And I think you can see why that might be the case, because by electrically and secretly, in Sullivan's case, recording phenomena, you really are able to literally be there in a way that the reminiscent methods of psychoanalysis and other methods never can reproduce as accurately. Well, you know, I'm sure in part, what Johnson tried to do. She tried to establish, as one of her missions, the extent of reliability of the social work history. And she did that in particular around the problem of the schizophrenic family. And so she would contrast the originally given social work history with what she could uncover about the actual family events after she had used her methods to uncover the family experience. Now, her methods, as you know, were extraordinarily different methods. They were essentially the methods of legal authorities or historical authorities. That is, they were methods in which documentation was surreptitiously sought after, and more directly sought after, in which the methods of the prosecuting attorney were used in terms of extracting confessions from people. A net was thrown around the family so that people would be interviewed who knew the family even only peripherally, in an attempt to make a real reconstruction of the events of family life. And this required an enormous amount of work over many months with each family, and it was necessarily very, very small, the numbers of families that she investigated. And to my knowledge, the work has never been reproduced, even though it constitutes one of the most obvious challenges to our field that one can think of. In any case, what she found out, as you know or have heard me say, is that there was no connection whatsoever between the family history as elicited by the traditional methods and what she found. That indeed there was a negative correlation. And that the number of events of assault, rape, incest, etc., that she uncovered, even in the small number of families in these circumstances, was very appalling in her day, although today we would, after Judy Herman's work on father-daughter incest and a dozen other publications, no longer such a surprise. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons why she's never mentioned. And one of the most astonishing things to me is that the paper in which she presented this, which is barely 6 or 7 pages long, or the work constituted just enormous amounts. The paper which she published this material in psychiatry was not added. It was not one of the number of papers that was put in the book of her collected papers. So she's essentially been censored as a person. And I never cease to be amazed as I travel around talking to people, and I mention her name, but almost no one knows anything that she did. Even people who are very interested in the subject that she's did. So here's a figure that obviously came upon the scene too soon, and had what happens to you when you come on the scene too soon. You get forgotten. You're not present in the zeitgeist at the moment when your message can be heard. But the time will come, I'm very confident, when she'll be looked upon as perhaps the greatest innovator in this particular approach to discovering the facts. As you know, her conclusion with schizophrenic families was that the initial delusion and hallucination of the acutely psychotic person was a narrowly disguised reproduction of repeated realistic events that occurred. An idea that has not made any progress whatsoever as far as I can see in the world literature. It's an astounding finding, and one that doesn't contradict the genetic transmission notion at all, but adds a very interesting wrinkle to it. Indeed, you think that way. Excuse me?
That was Adelaide Johnson.
Adelaide Johnson in the Mayo Clinic group.
What did she work?
Mayo Clinic.
And what year did she work?
These are the 50s. The 50s. And one of the ironies that I never ceased to amuse me is that one of the many people, or a great many people, worked with her, some of whom made very large reputations afterwards. One of them was Sherwood Fraser, who now presides over an institution that seems to be intent upon demonstrating the biologism of schizophrenia. He was the woman who more than anybody else suggested the psychologism or sociologism of schizophrenia. He laughs when you tell him that and doesn't pay much attention. Well, that is something that I'm not going to pause long on, because the methods she used are not the ones that one can generally use in an ordinary clinic setting. And that doesn't mean they're not the best methods or the most reliable methods. They're just not the methods that one can use in an ordinary clinic setting. And they certainly aren't methods that you can use in psychotherapy. So I then move on, perhaps too hastily, to Sullivan and to the what I feel are the extraordinary intuitions he had in the development of methods by which one can ascertain some of the same kind of information, however, in a clinically convenient way, you might say. And again, I don't mean to say you can find out with the same degree of confidence and the same degree of depth of detail that she did, but one can certainly begin to make a real headway against the lying and the deluding and the fantasy work. And I've bored you before by speaking about the source of my interest in this, which was in part to understand how Sullivan was able to manage the difficult clinical situations he did, which was largely the basis of his reputation when he was alive, that he could come into clinical situations which were bankrupt, particularly negative paranoid transferences, transference psychoses, and managed to give people the help they needed to straighten out these situations. So I collected all these anecdotes and supervision advice I could find and try to figure out the principles by which he worked, because it was really true that had never been done. He didn't produce the papers on technique, for example, that Freud did about his methods, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was a piece of work that hadn't been done. And I think I had the experience, a very frightening experience of writing a book on this subject, and then right after my book was published, another book was published, which was a transcription of Sullivan's supervision of a catatonic boy. And although I'd seen some of that material, I'd never seen the whole thing. And so here I was coming out with a set of principles as to how he worked. And here this thing came along. And I was very gratified that actually it couldn't have been a more ample confirmation of the principles. In fact, there were some phrases that I got from that book which added to what I say, clarified somewhat, but didn't really add to the principles. So that gave me an additional feeling of confidence that the way this man worked, I understood something at least about the way this man worked. You know, if you think to yourself that we people are the instruments of psychiatry, you know, when someone comes along who's a genuine original like Sullivan, it's a little bit like discovering a microscope or a telescope in human terms. And so when someone comes along like me and tries to understand how a telescope works, so the engineering principles are of that instrument, I think when you think about it in those terms, I think you're thinking I think of it approximately correctly in the way that works. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about how Sullivan structured the clinical problem and how he set about trying to deal with it. And now I'm going to say a little about that, and I'm going to say a little bit about the contrast between that and existential work. And then if we have time, close with some of the ideas about the way in which existential and social psychiatric work might be thought of together. And then later on I'm going to go on and discuss the actual use of projective and counter-projective statements. Well, most of that you've heard me talk about before anyway. Sullivan thought that the interview suffered inevitably from two characteristics of interpersonal events. They suffered from selective inattention and from parataxis, or projections. Parataxis and projections are not just the same thing, although I'm not going to give the refinements of the difference, although I'll take up one important one. That is that the clinician, encountering the patient, suffered in the reliability of the material he collected from his own and the patient's selective inattention and from their tendency to project on each other. And these two ubiquitous, constant phenomena, made it very, very difficult for the clinician to know to what extent what he was hearing, whether it was a function, a moment, an artifact of the interview, or whether it was indeed the material that was reflective of some deeper, more persistent truth about the patient or the world. And see what a familiar way of approaching a problem that is. And it seems to me that when one thinks about that, one has to once again see what a major figure Sullivan was in the strength of his intuition. And Freud had essentially done that similar thing, hadn't he? he had thought that questions were not likely to get the material he needed. And hypnosis was not likely to get the material. So he had to devise another way to get around the naturally occurring censorship, in Freud's case, that the human being exercised over his unconscious process. That was Freud's formulation. That if you could sort of take away the secondary process, as Freud said, then the primary process would manifest itself. That was why the dream was the royal road, wasn't it? Because the dream was relatively uncensored, although still censored, relatively uncensored, and therefore gave access to this material. So Freud, too, was saying that you couldn't take the patient's material at face value. Now, along comes Sullivan and says the same thing. You cannot take the patient's sayings at face value, because in this case the problem is not that of repression or censorship, but two other problems. The problems of selective inattention and projection. And it's fun to think about the relationship between those two problems. Again, this is, as I say, it seems to me this shows how fundamentally they approach a scientific problem, because this is, of course, which is an everyday matter, isn't it, in clinical research, that you know that you can't take for granted that the material you collect about anything is by itself revealing of itself. That you have to do certain kinds of operations to find out what it really means. That's you can't just look at the patient and decide what's the matter with him. You have to go through all kinds of elaborate technical procedures in medicine or any other procedure to uncover the significance of what you're saying, you're seeing. Now, why selective inattention and projection? Sullivan and others have given a number of reasons for the occurrence of these obstructive processes in the interview. Sullivan's principal way of thinking about it goes something like this. Sullivan said that when I meet you or you meet me, you and each of us experience anxiety. And this anxiety occurs not everywhere and not in equal amounts, but occurs because our self-system is threatened. We feel that the other person may in some sense diminish our self-esteem, narcissistic positions we become, you say, but in some way diminish our sense of ourself or our safety, or as he calls security. And our relative equanimity is protected by security operations. That is, operations by which we keep out of mind, or in some way correct, self-threatening experiences in the individual. Now, these security operations, of which projection is one, are to be separated from defense mechanisms. And it's interesting how they're to be separated from, because you feel how up-to-date Sullivan is when you get a sense of the difference between the two. In defense mechanisms, the concept of defense mechanism, as it was developed by the ego psychologists, was the idea, and by Freud, it was the idea that the individual defends against certain impulsive threats by means of transformations of the impulse. So the impulse is repressed, or it's sublimated, or reaction formated, or whatever. In this way, the dangerous impulse is rendered relatively innocuous to the ego. This is not an impulse defense system. This is a self-security system. You can work those two things over, and you can find some common features, especially if you think about the ego as having some connection to the self. But in fact, the formulations are different. And this self-security system is, of course, much more like what we're hearing about from the Chicago Cabotians, and all this business about the psychology of the self, which goes way back, not only into Sullivan, but Adler and Rank and others too. Anyway, so that in the interview, I find myself unable to deal frankly with you because of my security operations. Also, however, here Sullivan is a little bit coy because he's afraid to take directly from Freud, which is a weakness of his, that he's not comfortable about doing that. In any case, he also takes up the traditional psychoanalytic transference notion that I cannot respond appropriately to you because I don't encounter you. I misperceive you. I see you as somebody else. Now, sometimes he says that I see you as somebody else because that's a way by which I secure myself. In other words, if I can make you into a familiar person, however dangerous that familiar person is, at least that familiar person isn't a stranger, and I'm therefore safer. He sometimes makes that argument. In which he puts the notion of transference on a security protection basis. Sometimes he sees it just as much more a feature of the way in which we see, essentially what the behaviorists would call a stimulus generalization. We just go on seeing people the way we've seen people.
Does one engage one's own security operations in order to transform the other, sort of as a projective, to get one to act in a way that one wants to personify the other?
Right.
Is that the way it works?
He didn't much talk about that, although there are allusions to it in an indirect way. It might be a way of controlling the other. I think that's a very important mechanism, and perhaps the most important kind of mechanism, and indicates that this system doesn't just affect our perception of the other person, but affects the other person much more directly in their behavior. Anyway, now whether you see anxiety as a product of the distortions of the interview or the distortions as a product of the anxiety is something you can get into great arguments about. And maybe you want to take that up. I find myself somewhat baffled by it as to whether the anxiety is a product of the distortion introduced or whether the distortion is a product of the anxiety. The Freudians tend to see the anxiety as a product of the distortions. The Sullivanians the other way around. It seems to me that both are to some extent true. I mean, I find it a helpful analogy to remember that every sort of human symptom, like a cough, for example, is both protective and also disturbing. And that the whole notion that something is purely protective is almost unknown in natural systems. So that it wouldn't surprise me if the distortion process really could be best formulated as both protective and disturbing. But that may not come full up against the argument. In any case, the result of selective inattention and parataxic or projections on the clinical interview meant that the clinical interview was essentially a fiction. The products were a fiction. And they were a fiction of the interaction between the two subjects and the various security operations that each one underwent. So I like to compare the interview to a kind of canvas on which each person paints the particular picture they need to paint in order to be reasonably comfortably present with the other person. Now, this is the same point we started with. Sullivan's intuition about this was his reason for saying that the veridical content of the interview was minimal. The artifactual content of it was maximal. And again, let me remind you that we can then link that to Adelaide Johnson's findings, where when you studied the product of the social work intervention and compared it with what a thoroughgoing investigation was, you found out that it was almost completely a fiction, i.e. the family's effort to conceal the events that had actually transpired. So I like to say that each of the schools has a fundamental rule. It has a sort of makes a demand on the clinical situation. We all know the fundamental rule of analytic work: say whatever comes to mind. And incidentally, that's not just a demand on the patient, although that's the part of it that's been most emphasized. Freud himself felt that the best attitude of the analyst was simply to listen to his own pre-association and understand the patient. And you know his famous advice, which has never been heeded at all, well, as far as I know, and the teaching of analysis was to never discuss a case until it was completed, never take notes, never try to remember what happened. Above all, don't work it up, because if you do that, you'll heighten too many conscious processes, and your own free-associative processes won't be free to understand the patient. And what that would have done to psychoanalytic education if it had been taken in a full-blooded way is marvelous to behold. And those of you who are interested in the politics of analysis, for example, those of you who've read Turkel's little book, Shelley Turkel's little book on Lacan, French analysis, know that that's it, that the famous, obscure, mysterious, Delphic Jacques Lacan has essentially followed that advice in his own institute. Anyway, so that's the fundamental rule in analysis. I've suggested to you what I think the fundamental rule is in existential work, and that's the psychological phenomenological reduction. That is, put the world between brackets, put aside your own preconceptions, approach the patient as naively, what Rollo May calls disciplined naivete. That's the appropriate, that's the fundamental rule of existential work. Or be credulous, as Green says, to the point of gullibility. Be taken in. Notice that wonderful word, taken in, which is really to be inside the other, isn't it? At the risk, of course, of being taken in, fooled by the person. But we don't worry about that because we know that every clinical method, by definition, has certain perils to it, doesn't it? That's one of the ways in which medicine particularly equips us for the study of anything, because we know the most apparently harmless medication carries with it significant dangers, and the most apparently pathetically ineffective intervention can, in certain people's hands, be very dangerous. So that we don't worry that something carries with it this charge of danger. Now, the fundamental rule in interpersonal psychiatry, I think, is best put: everything is to be treated as a fiction until shown to be a fact. Everything is to be treated as a fiction until shown to be a fact. Now, you can see links in that to psychoanalysis, in which everything is treated as a fantasy. Only in this case, not until it's proved a fact, because the fantasy is the fact. But I think that's the best way to, in my idea, the best way to conceptualize the result of these observations and intuitions of Sullivan about the nature of the interview. Everything is to be seen as a fiction until proved a fact. One of my favorite expressions of that is from the group worker Bion, who says that the main thing that you have to teach group therapists is to avoid the numbing feeling of reality. By which I think he means that you must teach the group worker to avoid colluding in any fantasy system of the moment. In other words, avoid him thinking that this is really what's going on. Be taken in by the clinical situation. Notice how sharply that stands in contrast to the existential demand that one be taken in. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I hope to interest you in as time passes, and as I did already to some extent, is the possibility that one might be able to assume both of those attitudes simultaneously. We talked about that earlier. So that everything is to be seen as a fiction until at least one is more secure about deciding that it's a fact. And of course, this is meant to be true not only in those clinical situations in which one knows one is in the hands of an operator, as we say, somebody who is manipulating, or somebody hysterical, or borderline, or psychopathic. This rule is to be followed not only in those instances in which we might be, especially likely to be alert to the fictions, but in every clinical situation, because the selective inattention and the projections are present in everybody. and therefore it is impossible for us to relate to each other authentically. That's the cynical seeming position that Sullivan took, this kind of paranoid, fixed paranoid suspiciousness that figures his unpleasant nature, very unpleasant nature that he had. This is one of the reasons why he and Erich Fromm eventually broke up the late. Erich Fromm died such a short time ago. Because Fromm thought, like the analysts, that the great healing thing was the truth. The idea was to get at the truth, to know yourself. Freud, of course, to some extent felt that way, although Freud was more sensibly cynical about how much people benefited from it. But that was where Sullivan and Fromm broke up, in part. Because Fromm really thought that if you worked away, and he worked very empathically, it really was to get at the truth, and that would be the healing thing. And I think if you think of the climate in which you live in this teaching, this hospital, I think you'll see that that's the environment here too. That the idea is to find the truth and make it known. And that's what our job is, to educate the ego, is the fancy modern form. Now you can see that Sullivan stands starkly against that. First of all, he doubts that the truth is going to be found, and secondly, that you'd recognize it very easily if you found it, and thirdly, that it would do you much good if you found it. And that the whole work goes forward in a manipulative way, in which the knowledge of what's going on is secondary to the masterful management that the expert, as Sullivan liked to call himself, conveyed or controlled the situation. Of course, that means that's the reason that it had even very quiet, timid clinical meetings and discussions, people almost get into fistfights about these matters. Because there are those who feel so deeply about the importance of the truth, and who are so repulsed, who feel such a sense of loathing toward manipulations, that when anybody confronts this quarrel, that people just simply can't talk to them. Just the uttering of those words is enough to produce the most fervent sectarian. And if you and I enter that situation, we say in our low-key way, we say, well, that's not polarized it quite so much. You really do have to manage the environment in which the truth comes out. That everybody knows that in analysis. You can't just tell the patient what's the matter with them. You have to set up transference neurosis and approach it with the utmost delicacy. And most of the most experienced people will tell you that you barely interpret at all if the patient, you really almost say what the patient's about to say anyway. So that the amount of subtle presenting and manipulating that's involved in that is enormous. And on the other hand, the manipulative stance depends upon someone having some sense of the truth and creating an environment in which it's possible for the patient to acknowledge the truth. So that the points of view begin not to look so disparate as they did before. But even when you've done that, they still glower at each other like mortal enemies, which to me means that to a lot of sectarianism is really temperament, written in institutions and ideas. I like to think that each of us goes into this work because in our heart of hearts we have a secret conviction, often not secret, conviction that we know what it is that helps. Either because that was the way we were helped, or that was what we're good at doing to help people, whatever it is. We bring that to bear on people, come what may. Sort of mad surgeons in operation. Well, I also wanted to, before we go into the projections and counter-projections, I wanted to think in a little bit the problem of what this interpersonal way of working is like. Particularly, how does it relate to empathic with what we've been talking about? Now, on the one hand, it seems very similar. I mean, Sullivan, you remember, often sat beside the patient so that he and the patient could look at the world where the pathology were. And Tom Guto and I call this the situational alliance, because so often by looking at something together, we project outward instead of on each other, and we are able to be companions in the management, care, understanding of that external world. In that sense, we're very close. We're very close. However, that still doesn't seem necessarily like a merger. So if there's an alliance present, a besideness in this work, it still doesn't seem quite the same thing as an alliance. However, there are circumstances in which they seem to overlap even more. That is, for example, if you empathize with rage, you automatically do something counter-projective, quite apart from these ideas of interpersonal. Because if I empathize with your rage, by definition, I have to express the rage for you. And if I do that, I'm pointed outwards, because rage is pointed outwards, as opposed to depression, which is more pointed inwards, isn't it? So when I empathize with rage, I automatically take up a position which is empathic, which is counter-projective, which is Sullivanian. So there's a point at which they come together. And that doesn't seem to me incidental. Because if you think about those cases in which Sullivan was most effective, they were almost always cases of rage. And I called it counter-projection. I would have rather called it counter-transference, but someone beat me to that term. But I called it counter-projection because it really counters paranoid projections. And in that sense, it's about rage in part. So whether it's really different than a special form of empathy directed at rage and projection, is that all it is? Well, that's a question. However, it doesn't always seem to be just that. I mean, for example, sometimes it's directed at love. And one of the most, and you've all heard me say this ad nauseum, that one of the most useful things of these most useful clinical places for these counter-projective ideas is in the case of the patient that idealizes us, overestimates us, where it becomes necessary to reduce that projection on us, which is just as lethal, sometimes more lethal, than the outright hostile projection. And the means by which we separate ourselves from this idealized figure are heavily in debt to these Sullivanian notions. And we know what happens if we don't do that, because just as soon as we make a mistake and go on vacation or forget the appointment, if we make some other blunder, then the idealization comes crashing down on top of us. And it comes crashing down on top of us, of course, with special force when we have people who split revel, the borderline people who turn negative and positive and negative very easily. Well, all that's familiar to us. So that part of this management of projections and transferences isn't just empathy with rage. Well, you see what I'm struggling with, to try to find a way to describe both of them in the same context. And on the one hand, they seem to have a lot in common. I mean, what if you talk about the environmental envelope of mental life, you're talking about sort of the world as I see it. And that sounds an awful lot like phenomenology, a lot about some of the things we've described. But it isn't quite the same thing, because the existentialist isn't so much interested in how it looks to you, more how it feels or seems to you. Not so much the veridical world as the world of your experience. And yet the veridical world is in part the world of your experience. So I get lost in the attempt to separate these things. And maybe one of you can...
One of the things that in empathic, what you suggest is empathic, the therapist experiences what the patient experiences. And where there's a kind of merger. You are experiencing what the patient. In fact, because you're experiencing what the patient is experiencing, you're sharing the same experience. Mm-hmm. Which is really not and which is not unlike sharing a common experience.
Right.
So what you do, you in effect
Common world, yeah.
Yeah, you're sharing the world together, or you're sharing a common experience, which is, the same thing you do. And if you think of sharing as the derivative to take something that's whole and
divide it, yeah.
share, then it's already there, and you're participating in an experience which is not unique to the patient doesn't own it. The patient happens to be in it at this particular moment, and you happen to be in it also with them. They're in it with you. You're in it together. And in that way, the internal experience is really no different than sharing a common external antagonist. You are doing the same thing. In fact, you're sharing. It's a share.
Yeah.
And that sort of, in one way,
right.
links
the
operation of the interpersonalist with the.
Okay, well, that's good, and I think I understand what you mean, right? And I think that makes sense to me. At the same time, there's some differences. I mean, the difference of suspiciousness. I mean, credulousness versus suspiciousness. I mean, you approach the patient with the idea that they may do a job on you. Indeed, they may. And that part of your job is to offset that. That's very different than being taken in.
You don't initially you don't experience this thing, and the patient comes in and experiences it with you. The patient's experiencing this, and you buy a share.
You buy a share.
You buy a share.
When you think that the share is genuine.
Right.
Well, there have been two thoughts, one of which was mine, one of which was Al Mardelly's, which suggested a sort of formula for relating the two. One, let me give you Al's first, which I thought was very neat. He suggested that the difference between empathic and counter-projective method is that each clears the field from the other side, the clinical field. That empathic work clears the field from the point of view of the therapist, i.e. by saying, get all your prejudices out of the way, and by being credulous and open, you therefore can see the person afresh. That clears it from the therapist side. And what counter-projective work does, he suggested, was clears it from the patient side. It's a thing that you, the therapist, can do to help the patient from distorting you. I thought that was quite elegant. So that the reason that you, the therapist, have a sort of double job is that you're the therapist, and therefore you have to be responsible not only for your own clearance, but to some extent for the patient's clearance. Well, that idea was presented in that paper he and I wrote on the initial interview. That was his idea, that coming at it from outside. And I thought that was quite elegant. My own idea, which I don't think is as good as that, but which has a certain value to it too, also I think, is that it springs out of my interest in distance. That empathic work closes the gap between you and the patient, while counter-projective work often opens the gap between you and the patient. And that's useful where the observer has decided that someone is distant or close, too close or too distant. And maybe that's similar to Al's idea of clearing yourself or clearing the patient. Because if the patient is coming on too strong, then the patient has to be cleared, so to speak, de-invaded. And maybe that's my way is simply a less clear way of saying the same thing. There's another way I've said it too. I said it before. Some of these things occurred to me, and that was to think of it in terms of the traditional task of analytic therapy, which was to develop transplants. And I thought that empathy. Here I'm following Kohut. empathy made possible transference with people who wouldn't otherwise be close enough to do that, i.e. the narcissistic character. While counter-projection made possible to manage transferences which would otherwise be overwhelming. That's borderline. I think to me it was very telling that even someone like Kernberg, who for the most part uses an interpretive mode of reducing transference when it's overwhelming, right? Constantly interprets to reduce transference distortions. Also recommends what he calls deflection, which is essentially counter-projection. There's a little footnote or parenthesis in his description of his method for handling overwhelming transference, and he uses this word deflection. And I think that made me feel good too, that somebody who spent a lot of time trying to manage difficult transference, turned, intuitively to this thing that Sullivan had developed long before. David?
There's another interesting relationship with Sullivan's scheme, where he has selective inattention being a method for allowing things in. Parataxis, a method for screening things out. By essentially creating a screen which allows them only those things which are previously open. And here's the relationship, when you empathize, you slip past the parataxis and take it in. When you counter-project, you are addressing the parataxis face to face. It is an interesting relationship between these two methods and the single scheme itself.
There's something about the selective inattention. What Sullivan meant by selective.
People don't notice.
People don't notice things on purpose.
Well, on purpose.
Maybe.
I mean, part of it is just normal physiology, readily we can take in. But he added to that, which was a certain
With a selective
screening.
part.
Right.
The relationship between those two dynamisms in his scheme of things, too, is one thing I want to mention about, where he describes it in the book Conceptions of Modern Psychiatry. It seems to me that he says that there's a reciprocal relationship between how active each of those things is, but it's not clear.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of whether the truth is available, which in Warner's is a long argument, seems to hinge on whether these two functions are independent, are really or on the other hand are reciprocal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'll explain. Selective inattention is what happens when you don't pay attention to what's coming in. In that case, as I understand what it says, that just means things are coming straight in, going straight into memory as they are, rather than being met on the way in by parataxic distortions from a variety of sources determined by the past. Selective inattention then is really sort of a negative way of describing something. It's the absence of resistance that otherwise would be put up by parataxic distortions. So what I was wondering is, he suggests that to the extent to which you selectively intend something, it isn't necessary to distort it, because distorting is ipso facto to pay some form of attention to it. You pay any form of attention to anything is ipso facto distorting. They're one and the same thing. Hence, is really the truth is embedded.
Which is really the progenitor of.
My question here is that is it true that in his conception, as you understand, but to the extent to which you selectively intend, you don't distort, and that things go as they are in the memory? And if that's so, then the truth is available if there's such a thing as associative method, which doesn't have the parting form of parataxic distortion. So things can come out of memory without having to pass through the same sort of filters. In that case, the argument is solved. If, on the other hand, they're independent, functions, then it would be possible for things to be selectively intended to just as distorted as they go into memory as they would have been as you study them in grade school. And I'm curious as to what
I
you
feel
think,
like I
first
should
of
know
all,
the answer.
about
I
the
feel like I
fact
should know the answer to that, but I don't.
Well, if they're intended to, who says they even go into memory?
They're
Well, if you look at family work, which is what you were mentioning before, sort of being the baby, or the baby, or offspring of the program, or some of the ancestors, sort of the more systems family type of work. Certainly, the people like Newton, who I know, talk about the fact that the parents selectively don't pay attention to behaviors of the children and are continually running into trouble with that and end up throwing distortions in other places, and that it is the correcting the balance of the attention, lack thereof, wherein lies the solution to maladaptive.
But you know, David, what David Mann is saying is that if you in order to notice what it is you aren't noticing, you have to have noticed it. And there has to be a very accurate perception of what it is that's threatening to you that you're going to ignore. Right?
There's also
Right, but does there have to, and it seems to be a lot of hinge on whether, what you mean by memory, and does something have to be remembered? Does Sullivan, I haven't read the book, Sullivan
He seems
require
to
that?
say, this is why there's a question in my mind, he seems to say that memory can be tabula rasa, that things can come in. Is that true? And then, but that you remember what you experienced.
But we know that economically, can't. I think we do to a certain extent. Well, weren't there a series of experiments done with perception of stimuli at different frequencies of flashing, even at those frequencies that were above the threshold for visual perception, the retention of those is certainly not there.
But conversely, below the threshold for conscious awareness, there can also be an undeniable influence on behavior.
I thought that was
My answer to
disproven.
your question.
I thought that was disproven. I thought that had been disproven.
Well, it's
still
argued about. It's argued about.
So essentially, the one way to phrase my question may be more memorial, so we can answer it sometime, is that there a relationship between selecting attention and parent access that's such that they're independent functions, or are they rather reciprocally related functions? In other words, if they're reciprocally related, the truth is available unless parent access works in reverse on the way out too. And they're related just much like the two physical data that you want to know, but you can't know simultaneously quantum mechanics because of some sort of interpersonal Heisenberg principle. You either know the truth or you get the unconscious through aha.
Let's say that the information coming in is also a distortion of the truth. So even if the receptor hasn't used its, if instead of your parataxis being focused on what's coming in or you're selecting an attention, just soaking it in, whatever is coming in, if that is a distortion presented to you,
Which we know it is.
yeah, then you're still not going to be able to determine what it is.
But I would be very interested to know also whether or not they were reciprocal or I don't know how you would go about quantitating or probably beginning to try to answer that.
The other question that might underlie it was you have a therapeutic impulse as opposed to what's their investigative one, sort of for what purpose would one want to know the answer to those questions? So what? Why read a book? I mean, hopefully because it will be of some use to you.
Yeah, one is like,
No.
It seems to me that it gets even more complicated when you think about these issues in one point in time versus, as we spoke of before, a time and space continuum for you can selectively inattend to something at one moment and then, an hour down the line, it may come to you in a different form. So that makes it more complex.
Never said it twice.
Were you going to say something about counter-introjective?
Later on. No, maybe we should stop. I was going to talk more about projective and counter-projective statements and forms that next time. I wish I could illuminate some of these considerations.
That's
Where would you?
Mathematical logic. This is where you got it from.
Sure.
No.
It reminds me of the Green Bay Packers.
It's a formidable comparison, right?
Pardon?
It's a formidable comparison.
Yeah, it is. Well, not exactly. Sort of.
What year?
Well, the year when Grabowski came in with the other $1 billion bonus baby.
And who gets through, you think?
Not necessarily.
Although that's another club.
More of DR and nothing else.
I like that idea. Changing the subject. I think that this. I like the idea of Al's very much. It's sort of breathtaking. Because that would mean that the two methods had this complementary function on the clinical field. To intended clearance on both sides.
Why would they be reciprocal?
How would they be reciprocal?
Why would they be reciprocal? Right? That's what I'm having a problem with. Someone had that idea or something like that?
He didn't make it explicit as far as I've read, but I haven't read that much.
Oh, you mean you're comparing selective inattention and paratactics to these two methods?
I wasn't
I'm
comparing
in
it,
that.
showing what
I
I thought
see.
their relationship was to this.
I thought your thought was independent of that.
Essentially, it was just an attempt to weave them together.
Well, but it might not be, because maybe the nature of a selective inattention is that it's sort of incidental or free-floating, comes through without any screen, without the presuppositions, right?
What
And
I'm
that
saying
you're,
is
that you're really not aware of it. It's an unself-conscious process, in other words. And that may be true of successful empathy.
that's exactly what I'm saying. That selective inattention has to be the dominance in the situation of successful.
You don't think about it till afterwards, a la Freud's advice about the work. It just occurs.
And it's not paratactic in as much as it's
I
not.
I don't think that's what Sullivan meant by selective inattention, but you may have seen deeper than I did. It's interesting.
I don't see it. I don't see the relationship between selective inattention and empathy quite that clearly.
I wouldn't have thought I did either.
Pardon?
I wouldn't have thought I did either, but yet it's interesting.
What he describes is information coming in and passing by a bunch of a network
Mm-hmm.
of sort of recognizers,
Mhm.
network of that it may or may not be information interact with. And as much as it does, it encounters a prearranged
Mm-hmm.
network of ideas that have been set up by previous attention to
Right.
the world.
Right.
And consequently either pushes those buttons and says, I'm
Mhm.
here,
Mhm.
as we've known before, or passes by, or on the rare occasion, I suppose, you want to use form, although it's probably unavailable even here. So, in as much as it doesn't register on that screen as it passes by, it goes straight into the memory, and it's not attended to. And when something is,
Like hypnosis.
yeah, and when something slips in like hypnosis without being subject to critical examination, that's complete selective attention. And it could
It's an interesting
be
comparison.
what happens in empathy is that things slip by without being barricaded by reasons.
But it's selective.
Yeah. Why was it chosen to be sent that route unless?
Well, it's better than
Because
being
it's the
attended to.
absence, it's by definition, it's the absence of that distorting
Or
or
was it, something paradoxical that said, we're not going to deal with that and selectively just find it on?
Well, if you postulate
question.
If you postulate those as security operations, which is what Sullivan, you mentioned that Sullivan and Simmons, that both of these were in fact security operations, not so much to defend threatening internal impulses that might overwhelm the person, as so much to actually defend against external situations that might threaten the person. If those are both installed in postulating as security operations, then you would want to look at them sort of as such that in fact to distort was one way of securing boundaries and that to selectively intend to was another way.
Right. You
Well,
wouldn't then know what happened to you.
Right. And so, what you don't know can't hurt you.
Right.
And,
Even though it may later, but at the moment it seems all right.
And so, insofar as there are security operations, then the issue of does the therapist, in performing one of their usual security operations of selective inattention, find themselves in this sort of eureka of empathizing with the patient? I mean, that's what I hear you postulating is that somehow that in the process of the operation of selective intention to defend against as a defensive mode somehow is related to.
I don't know if that works if you think of security operations as ways of avoiding anxiety. Because if anxiety goes up, then you selectively inattend even more, right? But if you're empathetic, you have less anxiety. So in a physiological way, I wonder if you can say that that can't work.
Well, that might be, but maybe the way out of that might be that the difference between solitary selective inattention or paratext would be doing it with someone who made it supportively possible to either examine the parataxes or be safe with this reception. But if this, what you were saying is an answer to David Mann's question, is it reciprocal? That's reciprocal. Your system is reciprocal. You're either conscious or you're not. If you're conscious, you distort. If you're not, you can see. I mean, you can receive. Right?
I wasn't necessarily postulating them as being reciprocal. I mean, there might be other security operations that Sullivan chose to selectively attend to or didn't come up with. There may be other ones. I mean, those are two interesting ones.
But from an existential point of view, there'd be only these two.
Otherwise,
You're either.
How about if you don't? What about if you didn't attend? Well, you mean to a threat.
Right.
What are the ways of protecting yourself?
Well, no, it's an epistemological claim. Either you're seeing it new or you're seeing it old. Right?
well,
Is that what you mean?
It does come down to an epistemological question because you say if these are the only two mechanisms we have of dealing with information, then we either keep it out or we fail to digest it. There has to be
No, we bring it in, or
Right.
we distort it, or we bring it in.
Yeah, in as much as we distort it, we keep it in itself out.
No, we distort it.
We distort it.
It isn't entirely a new product, I mean, or an old one. It's accommodation. What are the terms that Piaget uses? Accommodation, assimilation.
Is there light in your head when you look at products?
So there's no reason to assume that everything isn't distorted anyway, whether at
Right.
different levels of distortion. In fact, it almost has to be.
But that, I mean, it raises the other question. I mean, if you're keeping some information out and letting some information go in, it almost suggests that the information that's coming in uncensored is safer. But the whole idea of selective intention would be that it's more dangerous.
It's available to the unconscious or the insolvent system that what's selectively intended to is allowed to go ahead and have an effect. And sort of, what is it that he calls that little problem that takes place outside awareness? Not in the
Not the self system.
not in the self system. Oh, it might. It stays and has an effect, but outside the conscious self system, it has its effect in dreams, distorting unconscious energy.
Prototype. No?
Go the unconscious.
In the tripartite system, all it means is that that to which you don't attend doesn't make it into the conscious self system. However, it does come in unabashed and undistorted, in as much as anything is distorted in the process, but it comes in as raw as it can and goes into the conscious regions of the life where things go ahead and affect one another and affect behavior that are not conscious, represented in the self-system. But are people always aware of what they're do parataxic events also, or parataxic process events also, always make it into the self-system? Or is even your unconscious self?
Well, they have to make it the self system because the self system is part of what distorts it. Well, that's interesting.
Just wait till the kids who grew up on a diet of computers in their education make it into psychology and psychiatrists think of all the sort of new analogies that are going to be used to explain the same ideas. This is a lot of this one going to depend along the lines, going to depend on the size of the bit of information that you're talking about. Talking in particular in terms of
We better get our moves in fast. Obsolete.
It seems to me that a lot of arguments or reputations are going to depend on the size of the stimuli or the part of the stimulus that is going to be talking about photons versus facial features versus.
You might be able to recognize a new thing if it's haptemically connected to something else.
Right. And the size of the particle is going to make one of the dynamic.
Sure, but part of that is just a direct result of the fact that little things don't work that much. By the time they get big enough, they've got to be paid attention.